You will pack your things and leave this market today. This stall does not belong to charity workers. The other traders in Makola market had gathered by then, drawn by the shouting, the way people are always drawn to a scene that isn't theirs. Nobody moved to stop it. Nobody spoke up, not yet. All Neka had done was give a lost, exhausted old man a cup of water, a length of shade, and directions home. It had taken 12 minutes. 12 minutes that her own aunt would use to take away the one thing keeping her family from ruin. What none of them knew, what the old man himself had not yet said aloud, was exactly who he used to be, and what he still had the power to do. 3 weeks later, the whole market would find out. Neka Asante had inherited her market stall the way most things in her life had arrived. Not by choice, but by necessity. The day her father's heart gave out at the loading dock, and someone had to keep the family from sinking. She was 19 then. She was 24 now, and the stall, 3 square meters of wooden planks, stacked with folded kente and printed Ankara cloth in Makola Market's fabric row, had become the entire architecture of her family's survival. Makola had been her father's world before it became hers. He had started as a porter, carrying bolts of fabric for other traders for a few cedis a day, before saving enough over a decade to lease his own small space in the fabric row, a space he had been inordinately proud of, the way men who have built something from nothing are proud in a way that borders on reverence. Neka remembered visiting him there as a small girl, sitting on an overturned crate while he called out prices in a voice that carried the length of the row, remembered the smell of new cloth and diesel exhaust and roasted plantain from the vendor 2 stalls down, remembered thinking that this loud, crowded, overwhelming place was the safest she had ever felt. She woke before dawn most days in the small rented room she shared with her younger brother Kwabena in Ashaiman, on the outskirts of Accra proper, boiling water for tea on the single-burner stove, laying out Kwabena's uniform for school, even though he was 17, and perfectly capable of doing it himself, because it was one of the few motherly gestures she had left to offer him since their own mother had passed when Kwabena was still small, a fever that the local clinic hadn't caught in time, back when the family could not afford the private clinic across town that might have caught it sooner. Kwabena was the reason she got up every single morning without complaint. He was bright, the kind of bright that teachers wrote letters home about, the kind that had earned him a partial scholarship to a respected secondary school 2 years running, a scholarship the headmaster himself had once told Neka was the best he'd seen from their district in a decade. But partial did not mean free, and the balance, uniform, books, exam fees, transport, had crept up year over year until this term's shortfall sat at an amount Neka could not conjure, no matter how many bolts of fabric she sold, no matter how many extra hours she stood at her stall calling out prices to passers-by, who mostly kept walking, their eyes fixed on their phones or their errands, rarely on the cloth she was so carefully trying to sell them. "If I don't pay by the 15th, Kwabena had told her 3 days ago, not meeting her eyes, ashamed in the particular way teenagers are ashamed of being a burden they never asked to be, they will withdraw my place. They already gave 2 warnings. You will go back to school in September," Neka had told him, with more confidence than she possessed. "I promise you that." She did not know, at the time, how she would keep that promise. She simply knew that she would, the way she had always simply known things needed doing without first working out precisely how, a habit of certainty she had inherited from her father and had never once questioned, even when it left her exhausted and empty-handed. At the market, her closest friend Tolani ran the neighboring stall, selling beads and waist trinkets, and the 2 of them had developed the particular shorthand of women who had shared a business wall for 6 years, half business advice, half survival counseling, delivered in the same breath, often while simultaneously calling out prices to customers browsing both their tables at once, their conversations threaded through with interruptions for haggling customers, threaded back together again the moment the customer moved on. "You didn't sleep," Tolani said that morning, watching Neka fold and refold the same piece of kente 3 times, without seeming to notice she'd done it. "I'm counting," Neka said. "The 15th is in 4 days. How much more do you need?" "Enough that counting it makes me tired before the day even starts." Nanika managed a small laugh, tired but not bitter. "I'll find it. I always find it." "You always find it," Tolani agreed. "And it always costs you something the rest of us don't see." There was also Auntie Comfort, her late father's older sister, a woman who had never remarried after her own husband left her decades ago, and who had installed herself as a kind of unofficial overseer of Necka's affairs ever since her brother's death. Not out of love, Necka had come to understand slowly and painfully over the years, but out of a bitterness that needed somewhere to land, some outlet for a life that had not gone the way she'd once imagined it would. Auntie Comfort ran a stall 2 rows down and had made it clear, more than once, that she believed Necka's stubborn insistence on keeping Kwabena in his expensive school was pride dressed up as devotion, an extravagance the family could not afford and should not be expected to subsidize through Necka's exhaustion. That boy could learn a trade, Auntie Comfort had said, only last week, loud enough for 3 neighboring stalls to hear, timing her comment for maximum audience the way she often seemed to. Instead, you starve yourself for a school that will forget his name the day he stops paying. Necka had said nothing. She had learned over the years that arguing with Auntie Comfort only fed whatever hunger drove her, and Necka did not have calories to spare on feeding anyone's hunger but her own family's. She had tried once, years earlier, to explain that Kwabena's scholarship was an opportunity that did not come twice, that their father would have wanted this for him, and Auntie Comfort had simply repeated, with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided the argument's outcome before it began, that their father was dead and could not want anything at all anymore, that the living had to be practical in ways the dead were excused from. She did not yet know that in 4 days' time, that same aunt would use 12 minutes of kindness as the reason to try to end everything Necka had built. It was mid-afternoon, the market at its most crowded and its most merciless, heat rising off the corrugated roofing in visible waves, when Necka noticed the old man standing at the mouth of the fabric row, turning in a slow, confused circle. He was tall once, she could tell, though age had folded some of that height into a stoop. His clothes were plain, a faded short-sleeved shirt, trousers gone thin at the knee, and his hands trembled slightly as he patted at his pockets, over and over, the particular panic of someone searching for something they were slowly realizing was gone. Other traders glanced at him and looked away. One woman near the entrance muttered, "Mad old man wandering into the cloth section, wasting everyone's time," and turned back to her customer. A group of young men lounging near a phone-charging kiosk laughed at something about him Necka didn't catch, and didn't want to. Necka watched him for a moment longer, torn. The 15th was in 4 days. Every minute away from her stall was a minute not spent selling. And then she thought of her own father. How frightened and undignified he must have felt in his final moments at that loading dock, surrounded by people too busy to notice a man in crisis. She thought of what she would want someone to do, if it were him, lost and afraid in a crowd of strangers. She stepped out from behind her stall. "Grandfather," she said gently, using the respectful address without thinking, "are you lost?" He turned to her, and for a moment his eyes were unfocused, searching her face like it might resolve into something familiar. "My driver," he said, "my car. I told him to wait by the—" He gestured vaguely, his hand shaking. "I don't remember which entrance." "Come, sit," Necka said, guiding him to the low wooden stool behind her stall, out of the direct sun. She poured water from her own bottle into a cup and pressed it into his hands, steadying them with her own until he could drink without spilling. "Small sips, grandfather. Take your time." "My phone," he murmured, patting his pockets again. "It's gone. Or the battery. I don't know." "It's all right. We'll find your driver." Necka crouched beside him, unhurried despite the customers passing her empty stall, despite Tolani shooting her a worried, sympathetic look from next door. "What entrance did you come in from? Was it near the big clock or near the bus station side?" They talked through it slowly, the old man's memory arriving in fragments, and Necka patient with each one, never rushing him, never showing the frustration that came from watching her own selling time evaporate. He told her, unprompted, that he sometimes lost pieces of a day like this, that his doctors called it something with a long name he could never quite hold on to either, an irony he seemed to find grimly amusing even in his confusion, a small dry joke offered as though to reassure her rather than himself. "At my age," he said, "the mind starts charging rent on its own furniture. Some days it simply moves a chair without telling you." Necka laughed despite the tension of the moment, and something in the old man's face eased at the sound of it, as though her laughter had done as much for him as the water had. When he seemed steady enough, she walked with him personally through 2 rows of the market, asking traders she knew if they'd seen a black car waiting, until they found it near the bus station entrance, exactly as he'd half remembered, a driver pacing anxiously beside it, visibly relieved at the sight of him. "Thank you, my daughter," the old man said, gripping her hand with surprising strength before he climbed into the car. "What is your name?" "Nika. Nika," he repeated, as though committing it to some permanent ledger. "I will remember that." She waved as the car pulled away, then turned back toward her stall, already calculating how much selling time she'd lost and whether she could make it up before closing. She had no way of knowing that the man in that car was watching her through the rear window until she disappeared from view, or that he had, in fact, remembered far more than her name. Auntie Comfort had seen the entire 12 minutes from her own stall 2 rows down, and by the time Nneka returned, her aunt was already waiting, arms crossed, an audience of curious traders gathering in the way they always did when Auntie Comfort raised her voice, drawn by something that had become, over the years, almost a form of market entertainment. 12 minutes, Auntie Comfort announced, loud enough to carry. 12 minutes, you abandoned your stall to play nursemaid to some confused old man, wandering where he doesn't belong. Do you know how many customers passed your stall while you were busy being a saint? Auntie, he was lost and frightened. Someone had to sell fabric to keep your brother in that fancy school you cannot afford. Auntie Comfort's voice cracked across the row like a whip. But no, that's never your priority, is it? You would rather chase strangers around the market playing the good girl than think of your own family. I did think of my family. I thought of what I would want if it were my own father lost like that. Your father is dead, Nneka, because he thought of everyone except stopping to rest for himself. You want to follow him into an early grave chasing after people who will never remember your name once they're gone. Auntie Comfort turned to the gathered crowd, playing to them now, her voice pitched for maximum effect. This is what I have said for months. This girl cannot manage her own affairs. She spends her time and her stall's earnings on strangers while her brother's school fees sit unpaid. I have decided. This stall was your father's, and I am the eldest of this family now that he is gone. I am taking it back. You can go be a nurse to strangers full-time, since that seems to be your true calling. A murmur ran through the crowd. Tolani stepped forward immediately, her own hands trembling with anger. Auntie Comfort, that's not fair. She has run this stall better than anyone in this row for 6 years. Are you also trying to lose your spot here? Auntie Comfort snapped, and Tolani's mouth closed. The same brutal calculation every witness in every unjust moment must make. How much can I afford to lose defending someone else's right? Auntie, please, Nneka said, her voice steady even as everything in her chest was breaking loose. You cannot do this. This stall is how I feed Kwabena, how I pay his school. I can, and I have. Auntie Comfort produced a folded paper, a transfer document she had apparently prepared in advance, waiting only for a justification to use it, and today, Nneka had unknowingly handed her one. This stall reverts to me as of today. You have until tomorrow morning to clear your goods. Nneka stood in the middle of the fabric row, surrounded by traders who had known her for years and said nothing, the paper trembling slightly in her aunt's outstretched hand, and understood with a sinking, hollowing clarity that 12 minutes of decency had just cost her the only income her family had. An older trader nearby, a woman named Efua, who had known Nneka's father, opened her mouth as if to object, then glanced at Auntie Comfort's face and thought better of it, looking down at her own goods instead, unwilling to make an enemy of a woman known for holding grudges the way other people held rosaries. Another trader simply turned back to arranging his own display, the particular studied busyness of someone who has decided not to see something. She did not cry there, in front of everyone. She waited until she and Tolani had carried her folded stock to the back of Tolani's own stall for temporary storage, until the market had thinned toward evening, and only then did she let the tears come, quiet and exhausted, her forehead pressed against a bolt of unsold kente. The 4 days that followed were the hardest of Nneka's adult life. She sold what fabric she could from a borrowed corner of Tolani's stall, but without her usual location and regular customers, her earnings dropped to less than a third of what she needed. She went to 2 other markets asking about available stalls and found nothing she could afford on short notice, Nothing that wouldn't take weeks to establish the way Makola had taken years, weeks she did not have. One market official, sympathetic but unable to help, suggested she try again in a few months once a space might open up, advice that felt, to Nneka, like being handed a solution for a different, slower emergency than the one she was actually living through. On the third day, the school called. Kwabena answered, listened, and hung up with his jaw tight, unable to look at his sister. They said tomorrow is the final date. After that, they give the place to someone on the waiting list. I have until morning, Nneka said, though she had no plan behind the sentence, only the refusal to let her brother see her without one. That night, unable to sleep, she sat with Kwabena at their small table and helped him with a mathematics assignment he'd been putting off, the way she always did, no matter how exhausted she was, because some habits survive even collapse. Kwabena, watching her check his work with the same patience she always showed regardless of what else was falling apart around them, finally set down his pencil. You don't have to keep helping me with this if things are bad, Nneka. I can manage a trade school instead. Auntie Comfort isn't wrong about everything. She's wrong about the thing that matters, Nneka said firmly, closing his exercise book. You are going back to that school in September. I don't know how yet, but you are. She also walked 2 doors down to check on a neighbor's small daughter who had been left alone while her mother worked a night shift, sitting with the child until she fell asleep, bringing her a portion of the little rice Nneka had cooked for herself and Kwabena that evening. It solved nothing. It changed nothing about the 15th, bearing down on her like a wall she could not climb. But it was who she was, collapse or not, and she did it without thinking twice. On the morning of the 4th day, Tolani came running to find her, breathless, waving her phone. Nneka, look at this. Look at this now. It was a local news page, a photograph accompanying a short article about a visiting dignitary touring markets and community projects across Accra, as part of a regional development initiative. The photograph showed an elderly man in a formal agbada shaking hands with a delegation outside the Accra city offices. It was the same face, older, more composed, dressed for the occasion rather than lost and searching, but unmistakably the same man Nneka had guided through the market 4 days earlier. The caption read, Former Regional Governor and current Chairman of the West African Development Trust, Chief Obadiah Mensah, seen here during his tour of local community markets and infrastructure sites. Nneka. Tolani's voice had gone very quiet. That's the man you helped. That's the confused old man your aunt threw you out for helping. Nneka read the article 3 times, her hands unsteady, unable to fully process what she was seeing. Before she could decide what, if anything, this meant for her, a woman approached the corner of Tolani's stall where Nneka now stood, dressed in a neat blazer, clearly not a market trader, holding a tablet and looking directly at Nneka. Excuse me, are you Nneka Asante? Yes, Nneka said carefully. My name is Adjoa Boateng. I'm an assistant to Chief Mensah's office. He asked me personally to locate you after his visit here 4 days ago. It took some time to find you. We understood you'd left your usual stall. Nneka felt her stomach tighten. I did. I was asked to leave. Chief Mensah suspected something had happened, given how abruptly your stall changed hands after his visit. He was quite insistent I find out why. Adjoa's expression softened. May I sit with you for a moment? There are some things I need to explain, and something I need to give you. They sat together at the edge of Tolani's stall, Tolani hovering close, unwilling to miss whatever was unfolding. Chief Mensah served as regional governor for nearly a decade before retiring from politics, Adjoa began. He now chairs the West African Development Trust, which funds infrastructure and education initiatives across 3 countries. 4 days ago, he was touring Makola Market unannounced, without his usual security detail, specifically to see the market as an ordinary visitor would experience it rather than as a dignitary. He suffers from occasional memory lapses, a mild condition his doctors monitor closely, and that day, his phone had died and his driver had moved the car without him realizing it. He became disoriented and frightened in a way his office rarely allows the public to see. He seemed so lost, Nneka said softly. I just wanted to help him find his way back. You did more than that. You treated him with patience and dignity, when, by his own account, Everyone else around him treated him as an inconvenience or a joke. He has not stopped speaking of it since. Ajua opened her tablet. He also learned, upon making inquiries, that the very afternoon you helped him, your family relationship, an aunt, I understand, used it as grounds to seize your market stall, which he further learned was your family's sole source of income, and that your younger brother's school fees were consequently at risk. Neka's throat tightened. How did he know all of that? Because he asked, and people talk, particularly when a man of his position starts asking questions in a market row. Ajoa turned the tablet toward her, revealing a document. Chief Mensa has arranged, through the Trust's Education Fund, to cover your brother Kwabena's school fees in full for the remainder of his secondary education, along with a scholarship award covering his continued studies beyond that, contingent only on his own effort, which the Trust's initial report suggests is considerable. She paused. This has already been processed and confirmed with the school this morning. Your brother's place is secure. Neka's hands flew to her mouth, tears rising before she could stop them. There's more, Adjoa continued gently. Chief Mensa has also arranged for a permanent market stall to be secured in your name, a larger location near the main entrance, with an initial stock grant to help you rebuild, entirely separate from whatever arrangement your aunt believes she has claimed. The lease is in your name only, filed with the market authority this morning, unchallengeable by anyone else in your family. Why? Neka managed, the word breaking apart as it left her. Why would he do all of this for 12 minutes? Adjoa smiled. His words to me were, she was the only person in that entire market who saw a man in trouble instead of an old fool wasting her time. I have had ministers, business leaders, and foreign dignitaries shake my hand with far more grace and far less sincerity than that young woman showed me for free. He does not forget kindness, Neka. He has simply learned, over a long life, that it is rare enough to be worth honoring properly when he finds it. He has also asked, Adjoa added, whether you would be willing to meet him directly, at the Trust's offices, once you've had time to settle your affairs here. He was quite specific that there is no urgency, and that you should come only when you are ready, not before. Neka wept openly then, Tolani's arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing and crying in the same breath, the 15th no longer a wall but a date that had simply, impossibly, stopped mattering. Word of the new stall reached her by the next afternoon, a market official arriving in person, almost apologetic, to walk her through the paperwork, as though sensing that after everything, Neka deserved to have the good news delivered gently too. Neka went to meet Chief Mensa exactly 1 week later, once her new stall had been stocked and her brother's place at school formally confirmed in writing, wanting to arrive with her own affairs settled, rather than as someone still catching her breath from crisis. The West African Development Trust occupied a modest but dignified building near the Accra city center, far less imposing than Neka had expected from an organization of its scale, and Chief Mensa himself met her in the lobby rather than sending an assistant, leaning slightly on a cane she hadn't seen him use in the market, dressed simply, without any of the ceremony his title might have suggested. Nika, he took her hand in both of his. You look well, better I think than the last time we spoke, though I remember precious little of that day beyond your face and your kindness. I'm glad you're doing better too, sir. You look much stronger than you did that afternoon. I have good days and difficult ones, he said with a small, rueful smile, gesturing her toward a comfortable seating area near a window overlooking a small courtyard garden. That was, regrettably, one of the difficult ones. But it led me to you, so I find I cannot regret it entirely. They talked for the better part of 2 hours. About her father, about Kwabena's ambitions, which turned out to be engineering, a fact that visibly delighted the chief, given his own foundation's focus on infrastructure. He asked about her mother, about the market, about the particular economics of the fabric trade, listening with the unhurried attention of a man who had spent much of his political career learning that the most important information rarely arrived through official channels. Tell me about your aunt, he said at one point, his tone careful rather than accusatory. Not to punish her further than the market itself is already punishing her, but because I want to understand what she was afraid of, underneath the anger. Neka considered the question longer than she'd expected to. I think she was afraid of being left behind, sir. Her husband left. Her own children moved away and rarely call. I think watching me build something, Even something small reminded her of everything she felt she'd lost, and she couldn't bear it without trying to take some of it back. Chief Mensa nodded slowly. That is a more generous reading than most people would offer someone who tried to destroy their livelihood. My father used to say bitterness is just fear that has nowhere else to go, Neka said quietly. I don't forgive what she did, but I understand it a little. I want to do more than simply restore what your aunt took, the chief said eventually. The trust runs a small vocational and small business development program aimed at traders who show both need and capability. I would like to sponsor your enrollment. Courses in accounting, in supply negotiation, in the kind of formal business skills that might let you expand your stall into something larger, should you wish it. Entirely your choice, of course. I only offer it because I suspect you have more capacity than one market stall has ever given you room to use. I don't know what to say, sir. Say yes, if it's what you want. Say nothing more elaborate than that. He smiled. I have found, over a long career, that gratitude is best expressed through use rather than words. Use what I'm offering well, and you will have thanked me more thoroughly than any speech could manage. Neka enrolled the following month, attending evening classes after her stall closed, exhausted in a new and hopeful way that felt entirely different from the exhaustion she'd carried for years. Talani teased her about her new vocabulary, margins, turnover, supplier terms, but came, in time, to ask her advice on her own bead business, the two friends building something together that neither of them could have managed entirely alone. Within 6 months, Neka had begun sourcing fabric directly from 2 smaller producers upcountry, cutting out a middleman whose markup she'd never previously questioned, and her margins improved enough that she began, quietly, setting aside a small fund of her own. Not for an emergency this time, but for whatever Kwabena might need once he reached university. Determined that he would never again face a 15th of the month with nothing behind him. Neka's new stall opened within the week following Ajoa's visit, better positioned and better stocked than the one she'd lost, and within a month her earnings had surpassed anything she'd managed in 6 years at her old location. She never sought out Auntie Comfort to gloat, and she never needed to. Word moves through a market faster than through any newspaper, and within days the entire fabric row knew precisely who the confused old man had been, and precisely what Auntie Comfort had cost her niece out of spite dressed as concern. The other traders, many of whom had stood silently while Auntie Comfort delivered her ultimatum, now found themselves unable to meet her eyes, their silence from that day sitting uneasily alongside their new knowledge, a discomfort that followed her through the row like a smell she couldn't quite wash off. Auntie Comfort's own business suffered in the following months, not through any deliberate act of Neka's or Chief Mensa's, but through the simple mechanics of a market community that had quietly decided, trader by trader, to take their custom elsewhere. Customers who once shopped at her stall began walking the extra few meters to Neka's new location instead, drawn as much by the story now attached to her name as by her fabric. Within a year, Auntie Comfort had given up her stall entirely, unable to sustain it, and Neka heard, without seeking the information out, that her aunt had gone to stay with a cousin in Kumasi, her presence in Makola Market fading the way unresolved bitterness eventually fades when it finds no one left willing to feed it. Kwabena finished his secondary education with honors and, through the continued support of the Development Trust Scholarship, began university the following year, studying civil engineering, a decision he made, he told his sister, specifically because he wanted to build things that made ordinary people's lives easier, the way a stranger's kindness had once quietly rebuilt his own. He visited Chief Mensa's office once during his first term, uninvited, simply to thank him properly, a gesture the old man mentioned to Neka with obvious pleasure the next time they spoke, calling it, in his words, the politest surprise I have had in a decade of surprises. A year after the whole ordeal, Neka found herself doing for someone else exactly what Chief Mensa's assistant had once done for her, noticing a young trader 2 rows down, newly arrived from a village outside the city, struggling to understand supplier contracts that were clearly written to confuse rather than clarify. Neka sat with her for an hour after closing, walking her through the terms line by line, refusing any payment for the help, because some debts are best repaid not to the person who gave them, but to whoever needs them passed along next, she thought, watching the young woman's shoulders ease with relief, of Tolani's grandmother's proverb about the hand that gives, and understood for the first time that the proverb wasn't only about receiving eventually, it was also, quietly, about becoming the kind of hand that keeps giving regardless. There is an Akan proverb Neka's grandmother used to repeat to her as a child. Obi nima, obi kiere. If one does not know, another will teach. Neka had not known, that afternoon in the market, who she was helping or what it would cost her. She had only known what her father would have wanted done for a stranger, and she had done it, not because she calculated a reward, but because the calculation never once entered her mind. What she did that day, she had nearly forgotten within a week, buried under the more urgent worry of survival. But the man she helped remembered every detail. And the market, slow, watchful, and finally just, remembered too. 2 years after the afternoon she knelt beside a confused old man in the fabric row, Neka's stall had grown into something her father, watching from wherever fathers watch from, would scarcely have recognized. What had once been 3 square meters of folded kente had expanded, through the vocational program's guidance and her own relentless attention to the ledgers she had once found so intimidating, into a small but genuine wholesale operation, supplying 4 other stalls in the market with fabric sourced directly from producers upcountry, cutting out the middlemen whose markups had quietly eaten into her father's profits for as long as he'd worked there. She still stood at her own counter most days, still called out prices in the voice she'd inherited from him, still recognized regular customers by the particular way they touched fabric before deciding whether to buy it. Success, she had learned, did not have to mean leaving behind the parts of the work she had always loved. It only meant she no longer had to lie awake, calculating whether love and survival could both be afforded in the same month. Talani's bead business had grown alongside her own, the two of them now sharing a slightly larger joint space near the market's main entrance, close enough to Aneka's original transferred stall that she passed it daily. The space Auntie Comfort had once seized, now run by a young couple who had taken over the lease after her aunt's departure. Pleasant strangers who greeted Neka warmly without any idea of the history the wooden planks beneath their feet contained. Neka did not mind. Some ghosts, she had decided, were better left to fade quietly rather than being pointed out to people who had done nothing to deserve the weight of them. She heard from her aunt exactly twice in those 2 years. The first time was a message relayed through a cousin, an oblique, half-apologetic acknowledgement that things had perhaps been handled poorly, phrased in a way that stopped just short of the word sorry, as though the word itself cost more than Auntie Comfort could still afford to spend. Neka did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because she had learned that some bridges are better left unrepaired until the person on the other side is ready to do the harder work of crossing them honestly. The second time was a brief, unexpected visit. Auntie Comfort appearing at the edge of Neka's new stall on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, older-looking than her years, asking after Kwabena's studies in a voice that had lost most of its old sharpness. "He is doing well," Neka told her, neither warm nor cold, simply factual. 3rd year now. Top of his class in structural design. Auntie Comfort nodded, looking for a moment as though she might say more, then simply turned and left, and Neka watched her go without anger, only a kind of tired sadness for a woman who had spent so much of her life guarding against losses that had already happened, and in guarding against them, had caused new ones of her own making. Chief Mensa's health had grown more fragile over those 2 years, his memory lapses more frequent, though his mind on good days remained as sharp and curious as it had been the afternoon he first gripped Neka's hand outside the bus station entrance. He visited the market perhaps 4 times a year now, always with his driver close at hand, always stopping first at Neka's stall before touring the rest of the row, a small ritual that had become, without either of them ever formally deciding it, simply how his visits worked. "You've built something remarkable," he told her, on one such visit, watching her explain a delivery schedule to one of the stalls she now supplied. "I take some quiet pride in having been there at the beginning of it, even if my presence at the beginning was rather more embarrassing than I would have chosen. You gave me the chance to prove what I could do, sir. The building was mine to do. That," he said, "is precisely the distinction I have spent a career trying to teach younger officials at the Trust, with mixed success. Opportunity is not achievement. I only ever gave you the former. You supplied all of the latter yourself." He had, in the 2nd year, formally invited Neka to sit on a small advisory panel the Trust convened twice yearly, made up of business people who had come up through its various support programs, tasked with reviewing which new applicants most deserved sponsorship. Neka had been startled by the invitation, certain there must be more experienced candidates. But the chief had waved away her hesitation with the same brisk confidence he'd shown discussing her brother's scholarship years earlier. "I do not want experienced candidates on that panel," he'd told her. "I want people who remember, clearly and recently, what it felt like to need the help before they had proven they deserved it. Experience dulls that memory faster than people like to admit. You still remember. Use it." On the panel, Neka found herself reviewing dozens of applications from traders not unlike who she'd once been. Women running fruit stalls, men repairing shoes, young people trying to expand a single skill into something that could support a family. She read each application carefully, always looking past the polished language some applicants had clearly paid someone else to write, searching instead for the small, specific details that told her whether a person's need was real, and whether their instinct, like hers had once been, ran toward giving rather than merely taking. It was through this panel work that she met a 19-year-old named Abina, running a small tailoring stall on the market's northern edge, whose application mentioned almost in passing that she had once given up a full day's earnings to help an injured stray dog get to a veterinary clinic, a detail most reviewers would have dismissed as irrelevant to a business loan application. Neka did not dismiss it. She recognized in that small, unremarkable sentence the same unthinking instinct that had once cost her everything and eventually given her back so much more, and she advocated for Abina's application with a conviction that surprised even her fellow panel members. Abina's tailoring business received its sponsorship within the month, and within a year had grown enough to hire her first employee. She visited Neka's stall occasionally afterward, not out of obligation, but out of the particular gratitude that seeks out its source simply to say, again and again in small ways, that it has not been forgotten. Neka found she understood, now, precisely how Chief Mensa must have felt watching her own stall grow. A strange, quiet satisfaction that asked for nothing further, content simply to have recognized something worth nurturing and to have nurtured it well. Kwabena graduated at the top of his engineering class the following spring, and the university, learning of his scholarship's unusual origin story through a proud school administrator who could not resist sharing it, invited Chief Mensa himself to attend the ceremony as a guest of honor. The old man came, leaning more heavily on his cane than he had 2 years earlier, but present, watching from the front row as Kwabena crossed the stage, applauding longer and louder than decorum strictly required. Afterward, the three of them, Neka, Kwabena, and the chief, sat together at a small reception, and Kwabena, unprompted, raised his glass of chilled Sobolo in a toast that made his sister's eyes fill for the second time that day. "To the old man who got lost in a market," Kwabena said, "and to the sister who stopped." There is a photograph from that afternoon that Neka keeps still, tucked into the small ledger she carries to every business meeting, not for sentiment exactly, though there is plenty of that in it too, but as a kind of private reminder, on the days when the accounts are tight and the suppliers are difficult, and the work of building something honest feels heavier than it should, a reminder that 12 minutes, offered without calculation, had once rearranged the entire shape of what her family's life could become, and that the arithmetic she does every morning, the endless subtraction of costs from earnings, had never once been the whole of the story. 3 days after the graduation ceremony, before the pride of that afternoon had fully settled into ordinary memory, Neka took the long trotro ride out to the small cemetery on the edge of a shaiman where her father was buried, something she had done perhaps a dozen times in the years since his death. Always alone, always without telling Kwabena beforehand, because she preferred to protect him from the particular grief these visits stirred in her before she'd had time to settle it herself. She brought with her, that afternoon, a small offering she had never brought before, a folded photocopy of Kwabena's graduation certificate, and a swatch of the first bolt of kente she had sourced directly from the producer upcountry, the fabric that had marked the true beginning of her stall's expansion. She laid both gently against the modest headstone, sitting cross-legged in the dust the way she had as a girl visiting him at his old stall, and spoke to him the way she always did on these visits, quietly, without embarrassment, certain he could not hear her, and speaking anyway because the speaking itself was the point. "Kwabena finished top of his class," she told the headstone. "He wants to build bridges, Papa, real ones, the kind that let people cross rivers they used to have to walk miles around. I think you would have liked watching him draw the plans. He gets so excited explaining the load calculations that I stop understanding him within 2 sentences. But I let him keep going, because his face does this thing when he talks about it that reminds me of you, explaining fabric grades to customers who only wanted to know the price. She told him about the stall, about the 4 smaller stalls she now supplied, about Tolani's engagement to a quiet accountant named Yaw, who had proposed at the market itself, kneeling right there in the middle of the fabric row, to the delighted screaming of half the traders in earshot. She told him, last, about the old man who had gotten lost near her stall 2 years earlier, and what that 12 minutes had eventually become, though she suspected, sitting there, that some part of her father already knew, that fathers who raised daughters to stop for strangers were rarely surprised when stopping turned out to matter. "I didn't do it for anything, Papa," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I wasn't thinking about what it might bring back to me. I was only thinking about you, about what you would have wanted done for you, if it had been you standing there confused, and no one willing to stop." She sat a while longer in the gathering dusk, until the cemetery groundskeeper began his evening rounds and gently reminded her, as he always did, that the gates would close soon, and Neka rose, brushed the dust from her wrapper, and made the long trip home with a lightness in her chest that had very little to do with the money in her account, and everything to do with the sense that she had, in some small enduring way, kept faith with the man who raised her. At the vocational program's request, Neka began, in her 3rd year of involvement with the trust, occasionally speaking to newer cohorts of sponsored traders about her own experience, not as a formal lecture, which she always insisted she was unqualified to give, but as an informal conversation over tea, the kind of talk her own grandmother might have offered had she lived to see any of this. She always began the same way. "Somebody is going to tell you," she would say, looking around the room at faces that ranged from nervous to skeptical to quietly hopeful, that kindness is a luxury poor people cannot afford, that you should save your 12 minutes, your last plate of food, your good afternoon, for people who can do something for you in return. I am not going to tell you that is wrong, because I understand exactly why people believe it. I believed some version of it myself, most days, simply because believing anything else felt like a risk I could not take. But I want to tell you what actually happened to me," she would continue, "not as a promise that the same thing will happen to you, because it might not, and you should not build your kindness on the hope of a reward you cannot guarantee. I want to tell you only so that you understand this. The 12 minutes I gave a confused old man cost me my stall, my income, very nearly my brother's education. By every practical measure available to me that day, it was the worst decision I could have made, and I would make it again, every single time, even if I did not know it would ever be repaid. Because the alternative was becoming a person who calculates before she helps, and I did not want to become that person, whatever it cost me." She would pause there, always, letting the room sit with that thought before continuing. "What I am asking you to carry away from this is not a formula. It is a question. When you see someone who needs help and it will cost you something to give it, ask yourself honestly, what kind of trader, what kind of neighbor, what kind of person you want to have been, on the day someone finally asks you to account for your life. Then decide accordingly, and do not spend too much time waiting to see whether it pays you back before you act." Several of the traders who passed through those informal sessions went on, in later years, to seek out Neka directly, when they themselves noticed someone in trouble at their own stalls, uncertain whether stopping was wise, and Neka's answer to each of them was always some version of the same thing, that she could not tell them what the outcome would be, only that she had never once regretted the choice to stop, regardless of what it cost her in that particular moment, because the person she remained afterward mattered to her more than whatever she might have gained by walking past.